Hello again, it's time now for our Friday gathering, and this week I'm joined by Aontú Leader and TD for Meath West, Peadar Tóibín. I'm joined from our Limerick studio by Minister of State at the Department of Finance and Fine Gael TD for Dunleary, Jennifer Carroll McNeil, who's attending the Fine Gael Think-In and joining us from Limerick today, Jennifer Kavanagh, Law Lecturer at the South East Technological University, and Mick Clifford, Special Correspondent at the Irish Examiner. Now, we've all the party think-ins are going on at the moment. Jennifer Carroll McNeil, you're at your party's think-in in Limerick. Fianna Fáil are looking for cuts to the USC, as they said earlier in the week. Did you check the Fine Gael wardrobe recently and see if there's anything missing?
I think what you see there is a lot of government cohesion about trying to put money back in people's pockets and make sure that they can face into the winter with the supports that they need, particularly very targeted supports. This morning at our Think-In, we're hearing from a Fine Gael representative in Kerry who works in a family resource centre, who's talking to us about some of the particular pinch points that families, particularly families with children with additional needs, are facing. We're also hearing from a credit union manager from Tipperary who's talking about the things that are going well in people's lives, what they're not looking for help with, and then what they are looking for help with, and trying to really distill how best to target our additional resources this year. Everybody needs support. Everybody, in my view, needs more money back in their pockets through tax in particular. It's so important at a time of full employment. Anybody making marginal decisions about whether to work or work more, they need to be incentivised through tax.
Right.
But we are very, very clear about trying to identify the people who need the most support in this budget. Your
party once described this as the hated universal social charge. The Department of Finance, on the contrary, very much likes the universal social charge, regarding it as a progressive, a sustainable taxation that could fund precisely the type of things you're talking about there.
We have different streams of tax, as you're aware, through income tax, our VAT receipts, our corporate tax. USC is one of those. What I'm concerned about is what people are seeing on their paycheck. What I'm concerned about is how much money people have in their pockets. Whether you increase the bands, whether you decrease the rates, whichever tax you target, what I'm concerned about is what money people have in their pockets, whatever way we get to that. I personally believe, and Fine Gael believe, that we reach the higher threshold of tax far too soon in this country in a disproportionate way that's really not in line with the people that we're competing for talent with, that we are a more expensive place to live as a consequence of that, and that it's a disincentive to work. And so we want to really target that and make people who help people and families who are in that part of the tax bracket who don't qualify necessarily for supports, who need more money back in their pocket, and how to target that group in the best way. Like this year, for example, you'll see the benefit of free school books, of the supports through schools, of the changes to university, reducing the grants, enhancing SUSI grants. All of these are different ways of doing it, whether it's through direct transfers, tax reductions, so many different ways that we've targeted getting money to people. I just want to get to the rest of the panel. So, Peadar Tóibín, keep the USC and fund more services, or cut it and put money back in people's pockets?
Yes, the big lie at the heart of Irish politics is that you have parties like Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael who say you can have European public services on American taxation. And every time we have elections and budgets, that is the conversation. But for the rest of the year, every single newspaper headline is full of the fact that there is a crisis in housing, in health, in education, in transport and in childcare. And it seems...
what does honesty look like then from your point of view, and what's your party saying?
Well, what we are saying is that there has to be a cost of living allowance in terms of social welfare, in terms of pay in public service, and in terms of the taxation rates. But we should not go beyond what the rate of inflation is in terms of that. We need to make sure that people have the income that they're meant to have. Right now, remember, in the last year, for the first time in maybe a decade or two, Irish incomes are lower than they were. Their real incomes, their spending power is actually lower than it was last year because of the inflation. Because of the inflation rate. And we're saying you have to have an inflation indexed increase in the tax bands, for sure, in terms of public pay and in terms of social welfare. But the key element here
is... What happens when inflation comes back down again? Do you link it to the point that wages drop in line with that as well?
Well, first of all, we're not going to have negative inflation, so we're not going to be talking about dropping of wages. But we do need to make sure that people on pensions, that people on social welfare don't have a further erosion of their spending ability. But the key element here is we're going to have a disaster in the housing sector for another year. We're going to have
effectively, you cut no taxes. Jennifer Kavanagh, what's your view on it?
I think one of the main things we have to look at is actually getting value for money for the taxes that we're actually spending, or that's been taken out of our pay packets. because there's a lot of places where there's still massive issues with waiting lists, CAMs, friends who are looking for autism assessment for kids. There's just lots and lots of problems. Now, I know Jennifer was on about the €1,000 back to the middle income earners. There is, if it comes through USC, it's still going to be money back to people. But at the end of the day, we do rely on the state to do certain things. And if the state doesn't have the money to do that properly, well, maybe we should be looking at what's going on there first.
Colm, could I just say, I mean, Paddy has used words like lie and honesty, which are directly out of the American playbook. I hope we don't ever go down that road here. We had the biggest social welfare budget last year that we have ever had. We have had increases in ongoing payments, huge increases to pensioners, and then we had the additional double payments, the targeted grants as well. So we have never spent more money in social welfare than we did last year, and we are able to do that through our tax intake, and we are doing both, and we are doing that in a really different way. But we have the lowest income inequality in the OECD, the second lowest income inequality in the OECD. So what does that mean? It means we transfer more of our people's tax
Jennifer,
to people who need it. So don't use words like lie and honesty and not acknowledge the scale of our budget and how much money we are taking in and how much money we are able to provide in a targeted way.
Jennifer, if you take out the once-off payments that were included in last year's budget and you just look at the actual increases there were in social welfare, people on social welfare had a pay reduction because of the inflation rate, and that is
ridiculous.
A fact, and that is what the
Social
Justice Ireland has said.
Would you build it into permanent spending then in that inflationary rate? I can't keep up with your
no. All we're saying is that you have to keep pensions, social welfare, incomes, public pay at a social welfare level, and it's not happening under Fine Gael.
You've made that point, Mick Clifford.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in general terms, since the economic crash, the centre of gravity in politics in this country has moved leftwards, in contrast to some other countries, it should be said. And now you have a scenario whereby the only thing that the likes of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, as they're catching up with their USC proposal, distinguish themselves from the others in the left and left of centre, is this issue of reducing tax. And the question should be raised, are we a high tax country? I don't believe that's the case. Secondly, we're a country with an increasing population continually, and we do not have the services to match. I don't think there's any case for that. Apart from any of that, the Taoiseach has made an issue, according to himself, of tackling child poverty. If there should be one outstanding feature in the coming budget, it should be specifically something to do with that. And they wouldn't go far wrong if they took note of the RSI's report there in recent weeks about a second tier for child benefit, rather than trying to concentrate on this thing of cutting taxes. That's yesterday's politics as far as I can see.
I think that's right. I think that ESRI report was really important, and I don't think it's an either or sort of thing. It never has been. We've always prioritised getting money to people through the social welfare budget, but we can also reduce taxes. And the Department of Finance, they'll say it themselves, it's an important decision if somebody is choosing whether to go back to work, whether to work more. There are different ways of getting money to people, and it's never been in Ireland an either or scenario. We are doing both. We threw money through the social welfare budget, through cutting the cost of childcare, through cutting the cost of school books in primary schools. All of these are different ways of getting support to people, which is what we're trying to do, and maintain a working economy, which is what's paying for everything.
Jennifer Calmack, the OECD ratings that we have in terms of income equality, or the inequality, or but the lack of inequality is due down to the progressive tax system, and the USC is part of that.
It's not down to the direct progressive tax system. It's due to how much money we transfer from tax to people through direct transfers. If you didn't make the transfers, you wouldn't have you couldn't
make the transfers without the tax.
Exactly. And we have managed to increase our tax base year on year and year under a Fine Gael government, and we have been able to transfer that to people who have needed it most. This isn't an either or sort of thing. That's far too simple.
Just in relation to Jennifer's idea of we can do both, doing both was what the Fianna Fáil PD government did in the 80s, and that's one of the main reasons that we ran into a wall in 2008.
We have managed to do both and get back not just to a balanced budget, to a budget surplus, and put money in a National Reserve Fund and extend that this year to try to plan for an ageing population. We actually have managed to do that. We have managed that in a sustainable, prudent way. We've been criticised for not spending more. We've been, there really is a holistic way of looking at this. We have managed to recover the books, build a surplus, take in more tax, get more people back to work than have ever worked in the state before, and have the largest social welfare budget.
But you've left out, Carol, or Jennifer, you've left out completely the whole public services there. You talked about people wanting to get back to the work. One of the big reasons why many women can't get back to the work at the moment is because there isn't childcare. And one of the reasons why there isn't proper childcare services at the moment is because they're actually closing on a monthly basis. Over 150 have closed in the last year. Why? Because the government is refusing to fund that sector properly. There's actually going to be a strike at the end of this month where at least 100,000 parents are going to be discommoded because they won't have a childcare facility to deliver to. And that is replicated right across CAMS, nursing, doctors, teachers. They can't get teachers in certain schools at the moment. The public services in this country are creaking at the seams, and yet the government, purely on a marketing basis, is only focusing on the quick adrenaline rush of a tax break.
Right.
And they're doing that before
you've made
the
your point,
election.
Paddy Tobin. Jennifer Carroll McNeill, on that.
On which, sorry, is it on the 25%?
On dealing on funding the public services as opposed to making tax cuts that Paddy Tobin is characterising as a populist election pitch.
Yeah, so Paddy, as Paddy knows, as he contributes to the budget speech every year, he knows that our biggest spending is social welfare, education, justice. These are the funding of public services. Yes, we need more supports, particularly for children with special needs. Yes, we've reduced the cost of childcare, but we need more childcare places as our population grows. I know that. I'm a TD in my constituency as well, and a mum looking for childcare also, and I know what all of that is like. We are a growing population, and there's no question that there's pressure on services, but we spend our money on education. We spend our money on social welfare. We spend it on justice, on the salaries of Gardaí, essentially, which is what that means. And all you have to do is look at the budget documents to see the scale of our spending in these areas.
Okay,
but we always want to make it better and do more.
We're going to move on. This is breaking news, so I appreciate, all of the people at the gathering today aren't going to have huge familiarity with this, but On Board Pleanála has refused permission for the proposed development of a liquefied natural gas terminal on the Shannon Estuary in County Kerry. The decision was posted on Board Pleanála's website this morning. Shannon LNG had been seeking permission for a €650 million development, including a 600 megawatt power plant and an LNG terminal near Tarbert, and On Board Pleanála refused the permission for the construction of the LNG terminal and energy park at the Shannon Estuary. Jennifer Carroll McNeill, I don't know whether you're across this or were aware of this news as we came to air today, but what's your reaction to the decision?
I think it's very serious for North Kerry and for Limerick. I note the decision and really what we're trying to achieve overall. I mean, I know that the On Board Pleanála are looking at this in terms of the government's review of energy policy and energy security. Energy security and the cost of energy we have learned, is going to be the most important thing for this state, not just in the last 2 years in terms of the cost, but what it means for the future. And we have an ambitious programme for renewables, for offshore wind turbines in my own area in Dunleary, floating offshore in the long term in the West Coast. But we need energy security now, and I think it's going to be very important to reflect on this. There is, however, there is a Shannon Estuary Task Force, which is an independent group to set up to advise on how to realise that, the economic potential of the Shannon Estuary region. But government will have to consider this carefully, and it's.
Could you see your Green colleagues in government welcoming this decision?
I don't know. I haven't spoken to any of those, but I this morning, as you say, this is breaking news. But I think more than anything else, what I'm concerned about is the energy security of this state next year, the next 5 years, and the next 20 years. And I think we have learned that the very serious events in Europe, that we are not independent, and we should not be taking these things for granted, and that there is a very careful balance to achieve here.
I think it's a disaster, to be honest. We are the only European country without a gas reserve. We are the most exposed in European terms in terms of changes in gas prices. Most European countries actually spend the summer actually buying up gas reserves, so they have a buffer to deal with the winter prices. And we don't have this situation. In actual fact, one of the main drivers of that cost of living crisis that most people have experienced over the last year, one of the main drivers over the fact that most people's income has fallen in real terms the last year, is because of that exposure to the worst of gas prices. And again, we're going into another winter.
Sure, but this is a decision by On Board Pleanála. What would you do about it?
Well, I think the government needs to get serious and to make sure that it professionally applies for a gas reserve space within in this country. And the government have a hands-off attitude. Why? Because you mentioned it in the premise of your question. There's a split in the government in the approach in how to deal with this particular crisis of gas. We do want to decarbonise, but we're not there yet, and we do need protection against the whims of the market.
All right. We're going to move on to something else, because during the week we had the vote by the Garda Representative Association, Mick Clifford. 99% of the GRA voting no confidence in the Garda Commissioner. They say it wasn't personal, but if they're not voting for the abolition of the post of Garda Commissioner, can it be seen as anything other than personal?
I don't think so, no. I think you can understand perfectly if Drew Harris took it personally. I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is it's highly unusual. I mean, for instance, we're sitting here in RTÉ. Should there be a vote among all the staff whether they have confidence in the DG? Not the current DG, but in general, should nurses have a vote on whether they have confidence in the CEO of the HSE? So I just wonder about the whole premise for it. I wonder how much of it has to do about politics within the GRA. But there's no doubt that the morale within the Gardaí is on the floor. A certain amount of it has to do with this issue of the roster, but they're on slightly dodgy ground there, because they had agreed the roster prior to the pandemic, and now Drew Harris wants to bring back that roster. The rank and file Gardaí may be of an idea, and understandable on one level, that like a lot of the rest of the working population, they want different conditions in terms of going to work. I don't know whether that's behind it, but they did agree it prior to this, and also the Association of Garda Sergeants and Inspectors have agreed.
Why did it get to this point with this Commissioner and now?
Well, but there was talks in terms of going back over the roster, but they broke down. I think the problem is, if it had just been the roster, there wouldn't have been this vote. There are a whole range of other issues around it that are driving at morale. Drew Harris was brought in to implement the Commission on the Future Policing. That's a huge job of reform. And it was inevitable you'd run into some difficulties in doing that, but it would seem that certainly his style of management or whatever may be an issue. But it's a massive job that he's faced with anyway. Remember, this is the biggest programme reform in the Gardaí in its 100 years, so there was always going to be problems, but it's certainly the idea of taking that vote of confidence, I would question it.
All right, Jennifer Kavanagh, we had the Morris Tribunal, we've had the Disclosures Tribunal, as Mick Clifford said there. You've a Garda Commissioner starting where reform of the force, discipline in the force, management lines in the force, and also then trying to encourage greater recruitment into the force. That's a hell of a juggle, and then you have this vote of no confidence. Would you have some sympathy for him, or what's your view on it?
I'd have sympathy for both the Commissioner and the Gardaí, because they are going through a massive period of change, and a lot of people feel uncomfortable in change because they don't know how it's going to impact them. And yes, the roster is a massive issue, and lots of people have had massive change from working during the pandemic, new things that have come in, seeing that there's a better life balance that can be had, and Gardaí are just as entitled to a life balance as anyone else. But it wouldn't necessarily be the norm for a union to have a vote like that in the particular person, as in the Commissioner. But it doesn't really amount to that much, because it is just a vote. They do not have the power to get rid of the Garda Commissioner. But I wouldn't like to be in Drew Harris's position, knowing that many people do not have confidence in your role going forward.
All right, Jennifer Carroll McNeil, on opposition and government benches, people have expressed confidence in the Garda Commissioner, but it does put the Garda Commissioner in a difficult position in terms of generating goodwill to put through the kind of policing reform that he has to implement.
It does, and I mean, it is, as Jennifer has said, it is a very difficult place to be the person to have to deliver a programme of reform of the scale that the Gardaí are going through. Jennifer mentioned earlier about getting value for taxpayers' money. Gardaí work extremely hard, but we can always streamline our services and the organisation and roster to try to be more efficient and do more. Like, part of what's really good about the changes that are being made is centralising services like domestic violence services within each area, so that financial crime, because these are the things that are really, really impacting people behind closed doors, getting targeted by, fraud, getting, domestic violence, huge impact, and they need specialist services. So, but there's a big body of change, and it's not easy, and it's very difficult to be the person leading that, and we have to keep going with it.
Father Tobin?
I think that the Gardaí have been hung out to dry by the government. So for every year that Helen McEntee has
which part of the Gardaí? Do you mean the rank and file that voted no confidence in the Commissioner, or the Commissioner himself?
I think a big element of the morale collapse within the Gardaí at the moment is the fact, obviously, that Garda numbers and Garda figures are incredible. And just to give you some of the figures, every year that Helen McEntee has been Minister for Justice, the number of Gardaí in the state has fallen. That is despite a significant population increase. Hundreds of Gardaí are being attacked on an annual basis now. Hundreds of Gardaí are resigning and are leaving the force, and the collapse has happened.
Hang on a second. Helen McEntee was on maternity leave for some of her tenure there, so it can't be pinned entirely on her if you're trying to tie it to the person. And secondly, there was the pandemic as well. So you're trying to say Helen McEntee is responsible for all that has gone wrong in the Gardaí?
Well, let me tell you, if you want to protect Gardaí from being attacked, what you do is you'd introduce a mandatory prison time for actually causing injury to a Garda. If you wanted to protect Gardaí in terms of the job that they're doing at the moment, you'd make sure that you recruit better. To recruit better, what you do is you'd make sure that their pay conditions and terms are better. Right now, there has been a collapse in recruitment in Templemore. Why? Because there's no confidence in young people about getting...
One of the main issues with the Gardaí is the rostering issue. Where do you stand on that? Would you go with the GRA, or do you think Drew Harris should implement the rostering that was agreed to, the pre-pandemic rostering?
I believe it has to be done in partnership with Garda rank and file.
I think that
if you have a 97% section of the Gardaí rank and file who are opposed to that, you're going to have major difficulties in getting it through. And the Gardaí, after that vote was taken, stated that one of the reasons why this is so difficult now is because Garda numbers and morale are on the floor because they're not being protected by this government.
All right. Jennifer Carroll McNeil, do you want to answer any of that?
I think, on the one hand, you could talk about the need for better public services and delivery and efficiency. When we have a programme that's been delivered, a plan that's been delivered by an independent body that's set out a future for the policing force, that's trying to be delivered, we acknowledge the difficulties with it. I certainly acknowledge the difficulty in the numbers with recruitment. There's no doubt that COVID disrupted that, and that is getting back on track. We want to have more Gardaí. We want to have, people who want to stay in the force. There are a lot of competing pressures. I mean, I've spoken with Gardaí who have left to go into the private sector and take opportunities there. We have a much more fluid idea of what work looks like.
Why is morale low at this point under this government?
Well, but there is a major programme of reform. I'm not saying, and I've said that's not an easy thing. That's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to deliver. But there has been a change, as you said. This was an agreed roster. That's with the same group that Padder is now saying, that we should work more in partnership. That's fine, but there was an agreed roster. So something has changed in terms of the relationships, and that's very clear. But we have to support the programme of reform that was agreed, not just by the Gardaí.
All right, no, because I do want to move on to something else, Padder Tobin, and to you first on this. The issue, Chris Heaton-Harris and the Taoiseach, tensions between them on the issue of an Irish Taoiseach expressing an interest in a united Ireland, of all things. Do you find yourself in the rare position of being in agreement with the Taoiseach on this one?
Well, I do. Jennifer will be happy to know I agree with the Taoiseach, and I welcome his words in this. Maybe he was watching the Wolf Tones concert down in the Electric Picnic and sees the mood of the people in relation to this. I think Chris Heaton-Harris's statements that he shouldn't have said that is incredible. The Good Friday Agreement was designed to allow for political parties to work for legitimate aspirations. Irish unity is a fully legitimate aspiration, equally as legitimate as the aspiration of the union between the north of Ireland and Britain. So, the idea that we have to censor pro-unity views, but pro-unionist views don't have to be censored is ridiculous. And I actually think that Chris Heaton-Harris is by far one of the worst Northern secretaries that we've had, and that's a very competitive field.
I rarely find myself in a position saying Chris Heaton-Harris is not here to defend himself. But Mick Clifford.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's back to the old Seamus Heaney line. Whatever you say nothing. With Leo, it would appear to be whatever you say something, and he nearly always has to put his foot in it in some capacity. Of course, it's perfectly acceptable acceptable to aspire to United Ireland. The issue is timing. Is this the time for the Taoiseach to make such a declaration when they're trying to get the executive back on track, when there's potentially a looming issue overtaking the UK to the European Court of Human Rights over the legacy bill? I just think if we're all aspiring towards this United Ireland, I think people, particularly in the Taoiseach's office, need to be a little more careful.
Jennifer,
he didn't put his foot in it, because Micheál Martin started up the Shared Island initiative. There's specific funding now academically for people who are working between North and South. So if he wasn't to say what he said, he would be making a nonsense of some of the work that the Department of An Taoiseach is doing. And it is something, I can see it happening in my lifetime. I teach this area with my students, and I always just take a straw poll. How many of my students can see this happening in their lifetime? About 80% of the students can. But the biggest problem that's going to be there is when it's a mature political debate, and it doesn't matter what side families were on, it will be, do we want Dublin or London or Belfast running our housing, our healthcare? And that's when we're going to be at the position for a mature debate on the issue.
Jennifer Carmichael, whether you agree with the Taoiseach sentiment or don't agree with the Taoiseach sentiment or the timing or whatever, but he was in Northern Ireland to announce the unveiling of a €1.1 billion fund co-funded by the EU, the Irish government and the UK government, and that got buried under all of this. So was it mishandled?
No, I don't think so. And I'd be a very cautious person on Northern Ireland, as Padder and others know. But I thought the Taoiseach said it very clearly this morning. I mean, we have an entitlement and our own right to say what we believe in relation to this island. The Taoiseach said this morning that, Rishi Sunak has described himself as a proud unionist. He's been appointed himself as Minister for the Union. Previous Prime Ministers did the same thing. The Secretary of State often talks about how committed he is to the Union. So why shouldn't Irish government representatives talk about what their view is? He didn't initiate this conversation. He was asked a direct question about something he'd said before.
Would he say the same thing? Though.
He has said the same thing before. And I think what's really frustrating about this is quite how far the Irish government has gone to be helpful to the UK government at all of the different stages, the withdrawal agreement, the Windsor framework, all of the different things, agreements that were not upheld by the UK government. And I'll use a very strong word here, the disgrace that is the legacy bill that has gone through, with every party in this state opposing it, every party in Northern Ireland opposing it, the Lib Dems and the Labour Party opposing it, and it was an absolute disgrace that was put through. And the Irish government opposed that. That's under consideration, as you know. But that's how strongly we feel. And so the idea that the Taoiseach can't articulate what's in the constitution of this state, that somehow we have to bend over to the Secretary of State's feelings on this, I'm sorry, it's going a bit far.
All right. I just want very, very briefly, finally, to yourself, Jennifer Carl McNeil, your colleague Brendan Griffin, in a sharp exchange during the week with Robert Short from the RTÉ board on the issue of the payment of the licence fee. There seemed to be some ambiguity as to whether or not payment of the licence fee was a good idea or indeed open to some form of exercise of discretion. Do you think it's unfortunate that people are saying we understand why people aren't paying the licence fee when it's a form of tax that people are obliged to pay by law?
It's a tax and you're obliged to pay it. And RTÉ are going through a major programme of reform. And, I hope that when they do present the strategic plan, that it's credible and it's got a long-term vision, that it enhances the opportunity for creative work around Ireland, the independent broadcasting sector, who actually do an awful lot around Dublin and Wicklow. And I'd like to see RTÉ present a very, very credible programme, not just to the Oireachtas, not just to the government, but to the Irish people who are paying the licence fee.
It's midday, we're out of time. Thanks for listening. You can catch up on anything you might have missed on this morning's show on the RTÉ Radio app. Today's programme was produced by Rachel Graham, research was by Kieran Dunn, broadcast coordinator was Michelle Gibson, on sound James Feeney. Now it's over to Louise Duffy.